Welcome everyone to the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies, and I'm really honored to invite you all to be here today for a talk by Dr. Amy Malek called Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in the Global Iranian Diaspora, which is a preview of Dr. Malek's forthcoming book, which I think will be in the fall 2025 from NYU Press. Amy Malek is a sociocultural anthropologist specializing in the intersection of migration, citizenship, memory, and culture. She is associate professor of global studies at Oklahoma State University, where she holds the Endowed Chair and serves as the director of the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program. Her forthcoming book, Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in the Global Iranian Diaspora, offers a transnational ethnography examining the impacts of cultural policies on Iranian diasporic communities in Sweden, Canada, and the United States. And I want to just add my special congratulations to Amy. I know she's been working hard on this book for a while, and also running a program at Oklahoma State. So it's a big deal for us to get a preview of her book. And I also want to say how much I admire her work as an anthropologist, as a colleague, and how important it's been for me to do this work alongside Amy, and how much I look forward to her continued leadership in this field. So welcome everyone, and welcome to Amy. So I'm gonna let Amy have the floor for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll resume afterwards for questions. And if you're comfortable asking directly, I'll call on you once you raise your hand. So welcome everyone. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Persis. This is such an honor to be able to be with you today. As you said, I've been working on this book for over 15 years somehow. That's what happens. But this is the first time I'm speaking about it as a book. So I'm really honored that it's at your invitation that I get to do that, and for the center, which has meant so much for so many of us. And, we've all really benefited immensely from the work that you've done, Persis John, and what you've accomplished with the center has been so transformative for our field. So I trust that that foundation you've built will remain the bedrock of a growing and thriving field. And I just want to thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you.
So I will share my slides and okay. So if you're Iranian American, I think many of you here today are, your social media algorithms are probably really similar to mine. And in that case, you also have been kind of bombarded in the last month or so with a particular earworm by one Edward Sheeran, which has been this kind of craze all of a sudden. This song that he's put out called Azizem was produced by an Iranian Swedish producer. It debuted at number 28 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it was teased for weeks, especially around Nowruz, and it was all over social media. It really caught the attention of a lot of Iranians around the world who kept commenting on it and sharing it and talking about it, which led to one Maj Jabrani, our resident stand-up comic in our community, to make a video about it. So, stand-up comedians are kind of known for being keen observers of the world around them, and this was what was going on in his world. So I want to play this really quick reel and talk about it in a moment.
Ed Sheeran is coming out with a song called Azizem, which in Persian means my dear, my love. Azizem, which is a great term that we use in our community. And Iranians on social media are ecstatic. We're super excited. I'll tell you why. Because ever since we came to the West, we came to America, we've been getting negative press from day one. From the hostage crisis to the movie Not Without My Daughter to September 11th. Which wasn't us, but this is America, so we still got blamed for it. That's always been the kind of stuff we've gotten. So anytime anyone in the West does anything remotely good about us, we get excited. Like when Anthony Bourdain went to Iran and did that episode, and Iranians were like, "Did you see Anthony Bourdain? He went to Iran. He said Iranians are very hospitable. The food is delicious." We were excited. Or like when Asghar Farhadi won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film. Asghar Farhadi is Iranian, but he won the Oscar. Iran's like, we won an Oscar. We won an Oscar. And now Ed Sheeran is putting out. You see, we're excited because we need the positive news. With the people love us. The Persian, like the cat.
Okay, so this kind of riffs on a trend in our diaspora of this kind of common sentiment, and perhaps one that you may be very familiar with, of really being frustrated at the amount of negative representation and the comparative lack of positive representation, and of course riffing on his own jokes about, love us, we're Persian like the cat, meow. So I have a whole separate talk that we can talk about with that. But for now, I want to kind of bring this up because, as I'm writing this talk, I see this video, I think, well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So here Maz is expressing this really common sentiment, this deep frustration with a pervasive and extensive negative representation and set of stereotypes about Iranians, especially in the United States, but in Western Europe and North America more broadly, we could say. And so that has led to this kind of unquenchable thirst, it seems, for positive representation in a mainstream setting. And of course, I've observed this as a member of the diaspora, but also as an anthropologist interested in Iranian diaspora cultural production. So in the course of about 16 years of field work between 2007 and 2023, and over 125 interviews I've conducted with cultural organizers and community members in the Iranian diaspora in 3 different countries, I repeatedly heard from first-generation entrepreneurs and professionals that countering negative stereotypes indeed was motivating their cultural organizing. For example, when I conducted fieldwork in Toronto, Canada, I marveled at the fact that over 300 Iranian Canadian volunteers were committing so much of their free time, taking time off full-time jobs as attorneys and tech professionals, architects, and sales reps to organize and run Tirgan, the largest Iranian arts and cultural festival in the world, which draws over 150,000 people to its grounds every July. When I put the question to Maria, the festival's artistic director in 2011, she answered by recalling the beginning of her cultural work in the early 2000s, before she'd completed her PhD in theoretical chemistry at the University of Toronto. She referred specifically to 2003, when Zahra Kazemi, a Canadian Iranian photojournalist, had been killed in an Iranian prison. The news had led to a media maelstrom in Canada. She said, the papers were full of Iran kills journalist. She said, Iran, 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 it's always continued by something negative. And I wrote this email to a news group of Iranians in Toronto at the time and said, the name Iran itself, not necessarily just the government, is usually mentioned with something really negative, very ugly. Let's do something cultural. Let's put a face to this name, to this word, Iran. Because people can relate to culture quite easily. Let's just show another face of Iran. In the same period that Maria and her friends were embarking on cultural organizing in Toronto, Iranians in New York were organizing the first Persian parade, one of 180 ethnic parades that march down Manhattan's avenues each year, making it a very key form of ethnic visibility in a multicultural city. Explaining their motivations for volunteering substantial time and resources for this kind of an endeavor since 2004, Zohra, a lead organizer of the parade, echoed to me what Maria had also said when she described in 2009 the hypervisibility of a view of Iran in the media after 9/11 that had led to feelings of invisibility for Iranian Americans in her community. She said, we want to show the Iranian community and that as a community, we're very powerful and really should take pride in our achievement in this country. And also for our American friends to see us in a different light, to see us, that we are a peaceful nation, that we come from a long heritage of civilization, that we're not the images that they see on TV. We really are not. And we're their friends, we're their neighbors, we're their doctors, their lawyers, their accountants, and they really, really should look at us in that light, not the way that the media has portrayed us in the last few years. So this kind of a sentiment of suggesting that there is a dichotomy between what you see on the news and what real Iranians are like, and what real Iranian history and heritage is like, is one that I heard again and again. So Iranian immigrants from diverse political, ethnic, and professional backgrounds across the diaspora have worked to insert their own cultural representations in mainstream publics, not only to evangelize about a homeland, but specifically to correct what they view as misrepresentations that have resulted from and led to the misrecognition of Iranians in their diasporic homes. They especially have sought to reassert the dignity of Iranian identity in the face of over 4 decades of geopolitical tensions between governments in Iran and in the West, all of which have contributed to their personal experiences of stigmatization, prejudice, and discrimination. While there are many ways to fight these exclusions and misrecognitions, diaspora Iranians have repeatedly turned to culture as a strategy of inclusion in their multicultural societies. My forthcoming book, Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in the Global Iranian Diaspora, is a comparative transnational ethnography of Iranian diasporic cultural citizenship in Los Angeles, Stockholm, and Toronto. There I examine how these processes of representing Iranian culture in the diaspora generates not only competing views of what it means to be Iranian, but also competing modes of belonging that variously subvert and reinforce existing power relations across local, national, and transnational scales. Across 5 substantive chapters, the book examines how Iranian immigrants in these 3 locations mobilize cultural production. Here I'm looking at festivals, exhibitions, parades, and public art to counter exclusion, to shape public perceptions, and to build new forms of belonging. By tracing how Iranians engage with multicultural policies, media representations, and intra-community debates about things like authenticity, I show that culture serves as a critical strategy for negotiating inclusion in diaspora. While often framed as apolitical, and indeed why they choose cultural is because they think it's non-political, these cultural projects are often deeply political, especially in their efforts to reclaim representation, resist misrecognition, and navigate the racial, social, and economic hierarchies of their societies. The argument of the book is presented in 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Departures and Arrivals, draws on interviews, national statistical data, and archival material to trace the global trajectory of Iranian migration, both emigration and immigration, since the second half of the 20th century to the United States, Sweden, and Canada. It connects these migration flows to the experiments with multiculturalism that were taking place in each of these societies just as Iranians began to arrive in large numbers. The following 3 chapters focus on each of the 3 cities under study, and through the lens of Iranian community-produced public art festivals and exhibitions, they each examine the strategies of inclusion that result from different approaches to and negotiations with multiculturalism. For example, in Chapter 2, Asserting Freedom, Dignity, and Wealth in Los Angeles, ethnographic attention is focused on the 2013 U.S. tour of the Cyrus Cylinder and the 2017 Freedom Sculpture and the festival that inspired in Los Angeles. It demonstrates how Iranian Americans, like other immigrants in the United States, are navigating neoliberal multiculturalism as an alternative pathway to power, centering notions of immigrant success and contribution alongside nostalgic and nationalist renderings of Iranian culture that can demonstrate, quote, good citizenship and thus deservingness for belonging. Given this context, I examine how and why certain forms of imperial nostalgia permeate so many Iranian American representations of culture and history. I'll return to this chapter in a moment. Unlike American neoliberal multiculturalism, Sweden's rapidly changing demographics and new approaches to official multiculturalism in the 1970s were reformed by the 2010s to prioritize cultural policies that tied financial and symbolic support to specific integration efforts. Unlike American neoliberal multiculturalism, that meant that Sweden was using discourses of interculturalism, described as a bidirectional process in which both immigrants and the mainstream Swedish society adjust to one another, as opposed to the traditional one-way assimilation of immigrants into a hegemonic mainstream. This ideology was supported and expressed through cultural policies implemented in the 2010s by intermediary institutions like Riksteatern, this is Sweden's national touring theater, and their representatives, including Iranian cultural workers hired into influential positions. These individuals not only brought professional arts experience and a mandate from the state, they also had the support of the state's budget and the intermediary institutions' networks and reputations within Swedish society and politics. So in Chapter 3, Contesting Cultural Belongings in Stockholm, I trace how these professionals and their Iranian community partners created Eldfesten, a Çarşambesuri festival that is aimed to represent Iranian arts and culture while also adhering to Swedish cultural policy imperatives of interculturalism. In my 2012 observations at the meeting tables, this approach included deliberately diversifying performances and inviting English and Swedish speakers as hosts and audience rather than only Persian speakers. It also included responding to contestations over cultural ownership brought forward by members of the community through direct reference to Swedish hegemonic discourses of democracy, anti-racism, and diversity. The result has been an annual celebration of Çarşambesuri as Eldfesten that looks much different from the holiday celebrated in Iran. It has thus spurred community contestations around authenticity and cultural ownership, while nevertheless becoming recognized by Swedish officials as a Swedish tradition, broadcast live on national radio and TV and across the diaspora through digital media. Through a close reading of festival planning meetings, community contestations, and interview material, the debates and controversies that I present in this chapter pivot on questions of inauthenticity and Iranianness, as well as dual meanings of belonging. For example, asking, does cultural belonging as inclusion in multicultural Sweden require immigrants to give up their cultural belongings as in ownership of Iranian culture? The chapter demonstrates how state intermediaries enacting cultural policies of Swedish interculturalism challenged fellow Iranians to break away from nationalist and essentialist claims on culture, including imperial nostalgia, but also to practice, meaning to rehearse as much as enact, Swedish ideals of democracy, inclusion, and transparency, and institutionalized norms of behavior. These practices and the debates the event sparked reflect the ways official Swedish multiculturalism in this period rewarded groups who aligned with the hegemonic Swedish norms, whether by reproducing Swedish ideologies and behaviors or by innovating cultural events and practices that promoted the state's view of interculturalism through promotion of an expansive version of Iranianness as a strategy of inclusion. In Chapter 4, Navigating Multiculturalism in Toronto, I turn to the large and growing communities of Iranians in Toronto, where the Canadian mosaic model centers a top-down insistence that no cultural group, Indigenous, settler, colonial, or immigrant, is more or less Canadian than the other. This multiculturalism principle formed the state's 2000s to 2010s commitment to both symbolic and instrumental support for groups through programs that embedded principles of diversity and Canadian national identity. These policies succeeded in developing a common sense among Torontonians that demographic multiculturalism and the policies that support it are matters of pride for Canada and for Toronto, an assertion that was made repeatedly by politicians and community members alike on Toronto's festival stages. It is also evident, for example, in the development of the city's popular summer ethnic festival tradition and the array of community partnership programs, partially funded by federal and provincial resources that enabled them in that period, that have now been discontinued. One such partnership between young Iranian immigrants and Toronto's Harbourfront Centre enabled the creation of the biennial Tirgan Festival in 2007. By selectively drawing upon and reframing Iranian myth historical traditions in its name and its initial funding application, the organizers quite consciously sought to conform to Canadian multicultural priorities of diversity as a shared value for both Iranians and Canadians. Beyond Tirgan's name, this value was also realized through an energetic and motivated volunteer base of several hundred first-generation Iranian Canadians who worked to bring a diverse and contemporary view of Iranian arts and culture to Toronto. Tirgan's artistic programming, organizational structure, marketing strategies, and fundraising initiatives were deeply influenced by Harbourfront Centre as its state intermediary, and thus put forward Canadian norms of transparency, teamwork, and professional development as priorities equal to their mission of promoting arts and culture. They did this while carefully maintaining nonpartisanship and refraining from divisive stances in order to bring together a fragmented Iranian diasporic community. The result has been the development not only of the largest festival of Iranian arts and culture in the world, but also of the Tirgan family, a network of fictive kinship that has helped facilitate the integration of thousands of young Iranians into the Canadian way. As they volunteered alongside and for their new community, they also built emotional attachments and deep feelings of belonging in Canada. But Tirgan's alignment with Canadian multiculturalism has meant that in moments of contestation, such as during the 2009 Green Movement or social movements like the hashtag #MeToo movement, wherein community members challenged Tirgan's commitment to non-political and non-partisan stances, rather than take up community calls to resist hegemonic structures, the organization has remained aligned with the organizational norms of the Canadian way. These have guaranteed not only a continuation of the status quo, but also additional support from government granting institutions and community donors who support those positions. That is until the Women Life Freedom movement put the organization in a catch-22 that highlighted the potent element of transnational belonging and commitments to compatriots in Iran, suggesting for the first time the possibility of new strategies of resistance. These 3 extended case study chapters are followed by a final chapter that draws together their insights and examples to offer a relational comparison of strategies of inclusion and their implications. In Chapter 5, I identified different approaches to multiculturalism and immigrant inclusion in each location that have produced variation in approaches to representing and in many ways negotiating Iranian diaspora identity and inclusion. Acknowledging the many overlapping lines of belonging, the chapter highlights the lines of class, religion, and race specifically, both within communities and in relation to their countries of reception. These comparative discussions ultimately demonstrate that across diasporic locations, those who work within and reinforce hegemonic forms have been best positioned to prevail. However, they also identify contestations and local variation that can also present openings for change. The book concludes with a consideration of how strategies of inclusion and belonging ultimately are acts of home building. As the examples in this book attest, cultural strategies of inclusion operate in conjunction with political, economic, and social strategies in multicultural societies. As Iranian communities build ever greater attachments to their homes, they also experience ongoing migrations, react to shifting geopolitical and local circumstances, and navigate belonging in creative ways. The book ends with a reflection on how these ongoing processes have opened conversations and challenged attitudes about race, class, and religion, not only in the mainstreams that these public events seek to enter, but within their own communities. In the remainder of this talk, I want to zoom in on one section of one chapter, a location many of you here are probably familiar with, which is Los Angeles. And so, as you all are probably aware, among the multiple and widespread communities in the global Iranian diaspora, Iranian Americans have been especially prolific in these didactic approaches of trying to show who we really are. This is due in part to the larger population in the United States and especially California, home to the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran. But it's also due in part to the greater ubiquity of these negative representations stemming from the intense antagonisms between the governments of the Islamic Republic and the United States since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis. This state-level antagonism was translated to the U.S. general population through the nightly primetime broadcasts of a show called America Held Hostage, which was the precursor to Nightline. This not only launched Ted Koppel's long career, but also put a particular set of images of Iran and of Islam on American televisions every single night for 444 nights until the hostages' release. This primetime nightly reminder stoked American fears and anger, which also spread to the streets, neighborhoods, and places of business where Iranian Americans were suddenly seen as enemies within. These messages didn't end with the resolution of the hostage crisis and were reinforced by pop culture, whether through books and films like those mentioned by Moz, like Not Without My Daughter, which screened not only in cinemas, but in syndication on TV well into the 2000s and was even screened in some American classrooms, but also in songs, in sitcoms, jokes, bumper stickers, pins, and paraphernalia, all of which collectively contributed to a common sense in the United States about Iran and Iranians as backward, violent, dangerous, and most of all, America's #1 enemy. The string of political crises that followed the hostage crisis, including the Iran-Contra affair, the first Gulf War, and of course 9/11, repeatedly have reignited this common sense, confirmed perhaps most directly when President Bush declared Iran part of an axis of evil in 2002. But unlike in the 1980s, Iranian Americans began to organize against these representations in the 2000s, and in ways that are also reflective of a long history of public performances of ethnic identity by immigrant groups in the United States. Following the leads of Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Greeks, and Mexicans before them, and seeking to counter Persian phobia and trying to shape how the world views Persians. This is how one interlocutor put it to me. Iranians have devoted extensive resources, time, and energy to display their vision of Iranian culture and history in large American public spaces before non-Iranian audiences. I've observed these efforts at parades like those I've mentioned, both in New York and in Los Angeles, at public cultural festivals like the Mehergan Festival of Autumn in 2015 and 2016, in Orange County for about 15 years, and in Westwood, Nowruz block parties at City Hall celebrations like those represented each year in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Orlando, and at multicultural displays like the House of Iran at San Diego's Balboa Park cultural cottages. And finally, you also see them, of course, at black tie dinner galas, at elite venues like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where one organizing committee member was quoted by Vanity Fair magazine in 2015 saying, quote, "A guest came up to me and said he invited his American family members and friends. He told me that he was pleased to be able to tell them this is who we are, not what you read in the papers all the time." Taken together, the growing proliferation of festivals and parades, galas, and exhibitions in the Iranian diaspora has contributed to a widespread phenomenon of strategically countering experiences of exclusion by turning to public performances of art and culture as arguments for inclusion. These cultural approaches of what I collectively term strategies of inclusion mark frustrated but determined responses to events both here in diaspora and there in Iran that have led in part to the stigmatization of Iranians in popular media and everyday life in their diaspora homes. Taken together, the growing inclusions and exclusions are subject to fluctuating power dynamics, such that notions like national identity, diaspora identity, and related modes of belonging become, in the words of Nira Yuval Davis, simply, quote, a naturalized construction of a particular hegemonic form of power relations, end quote. Numerous forms of power, including those influencing political, legal, economic, cultural, and social conditions, shape processes of belonging among immigrants. Unlike in countries like Sweden and Canada, which I discuss at length in the book, the United States has never had a national multicultural policy to directly influence or support immigrant groups. In its place, a form of neoliberal multiculturalism has emerged, especially since the 1990s, with messages and mythologies about the role and place of immigrants in American history and contemporary society. As Wendy Brown has demonstrated, the rise of neoliberalism has brought about state disinvestment in the public, but also withdrawal from society more generally. In the privatization, deregulation, and other economic strategies that are traditionally associated with neoliberal reforms, Brown has argued that the aim is actually to change the soul through neoliberalizing society itself, diminishing and denigrating dependency on the state and the very idea of society as a source of welfare and security. Instead, citizens are encouraged to become independent self-investors who, quote, socially and monetarily invest in themselves to become more valuable, end quote. Or, in Aiwa Ong's words, to become entrepreneurs of themselves. This entrepreneurializing of every institution, activity, and service includes cultural activities and institutions for immigrants as much as for other citizens. Relatedly, in her analysis of differentiated and cultural citizenship, Ong describes a dual process of self-making and being made, in which subject formation is negotiated between state and subject through state intermediaries such as universities, nonprofit organizations, social service providers, and cultural institutions that work to create self-regulating racialized subjects. In neoliberal subject formation, immigrant subjects vying for inclusion are expected to become self-entrepreneurs, not just in the financial, educational, or health aspects of their lives, but also in the social and cultural ones. In this iteration of multiculturalism, immigration policies are mobilized alongside national mythologies of the United States, for example, the nation of immigrants seeking the American dream, accessible simply by pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, in order to create immigrant citizens whose identities as hyphenated Americans are both rooted in and dependent on the interlocking values of individual responsibility, self-sufficiency, and contributions to society. In this context, in an effort to navigate social and political exclusion, Iranian Americans have responded to these messages by employing a number of cultural strategies that have implications for Iranian identity well beyond American borders. Zooming in specifically on LA, today I want to focus on a portion of Chapter 2, where I seek to better understand why so many public expressions of Iranian identity have relied so heavily on imperial nostalgia, especially in U.S. cities of the Iranian diaspora like Los Angeles. I'm especially interested in the phenomenon of Iranian American imperial nostalgia, a wistful longing or affection for past empire, here the Achaemenid Empire, and how it's being used to introduce what diaspora members are terming real Iranian culture and history to American audiences. I want to focus on one such strategy through an imperial nostalgia phenomenon I've termed Cyromania. A 21st century diasporic fascination with the ancient Iranian past, Cyromania focuses especially on the life and legacies of Cyrus the Great through the proliferation of artifacts, narratives, and symbols originally made popular during the revivalist period of the Pahlavi era. Though different from the phenomenon of 19th century Egyptomania in important ways, for example, and that its strongest proponents have been Iranians themselves, I see important similarities in Cyromania's implications for politics, identity, and racial ideas in diaspora. In their widespread and often larger-than-life invocations of Cyrus the Great, Iranian Americans are not only or simply parroting nationalist tropes in response to geopolitics, they're also responding specifically to American experiences of exclusion and assimilationist demands that require immigrant groups to render their own histories and cultures within an American neoliberal frame of multiculturalism. Diasporic Iranians undertaking these efforts draw on collective memory and a common set of cultural symbols and narratives, ones I'm sure you're all familiar with. That symbolic repertoire includes the poetry of Rumi and Hafez, the heroes of the epic Shahnameh, holidays like Nowruz, the vernal equinox, which is recognized by UNESCO and finally recognized by Mickey Mouse, our arbiter of culture, in 2023. And its tenets attributed to a Zoroastrian heritage and the history of kings who established the Persian Empire, especially the figure of Cyrus the Great. Since the 2010s, evidence of the continued symbolic power of Cyrus and the Cyrus cylinder can be found in the wide proliferation of popular symbols across high and popular culture. Clothing, jewelry, designer handbags. This clutch from Neiman Y got sold at $700 a pop and sold out. As well as commemorative memorabilia have featured the Cyrus cylinder. Tattoos frequently highlight the Farbahar, here artistically rendered with a profile of Cyrus the Great. The names of children, businesses, and community organizations increasingly commemorate ancient heroes. And reproductions of ancient sites like Persepolis or Pasargadae and artifacts like the Cyrus cylinder decorate posters and flyers and events themselves. And also Iranian homes and restaurants in diaspora, whether in Toronto, Tokyo, Berlin, or Berkeley. And efforts by Iranian Americans to install statues of Cyrus the Great in North American cities have begun in earnest in Los Angeles and Toronto and in my hometown, Atlanta, Georgia. In 2023, a 9-meter statue of Cyrus the Great appeared in downtown Atlanta on Cyrus the Great Day. This is October 29th, in case you haven't heard of this now holiday. This is itself, of course, an invented tradition, Cyrus the Great Day, and most Iranian Americans had never heard of it just a decade ago. So Cyromania, as I am arguing here, is a spectacle of imperial nostalgia. And it's just an Iranian American iteration of a proliferation of similar spectacles in recent years. In the mid-2010s, we saw President Erdogan of Turkey create these kinds of spectacles that engaged in a nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire as a golden age where we saw reenactments and military parades featuring costumed figures in what has since become an annual commemoration of the conquest of Constantinople, then Istanbul. In Egypt in the 2020s, we also saw President Sisi create grand spectacles of imperial nostalgia and revive Pharaonism. For example, in this case of the Pharaoh's Golden Parade, which transported 22 mummies of the kings and queens in ancient Egypt to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in April 2021. As they're designed to do, these spectacles have drawn the eyes of millions for both cultural and political aims, provoking shifts in both the nationalist imaginary and identity. But the power of imperial nostalgic spectacle for these political purposes is not a new strategy of the 2020s. Indeed, it's been attempted by numerous parties and locations around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, including, of course, in Iran. In 1971, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, convened the 2500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, commemorating the founding of the empire by Cyrus the Great. So these celebrations are a clear spectacle of imperial nostalgia as well. They were a culmination of decades of efforts to solidify the Pahlavi brand of Iranian nationalism, first established during the reign of his father, Reza Shah Pahlavi. A key focus of Pahlavi nationalism, especially under Mohammad Reza, was the establishment of Cyrus the Great as a national hero. And that focus took form in extravagant events like the Shah's own coronation in 1967, scholarly conferences and publications, especially in the field of archaeology, and media and cultural productions like films, books, and exhibitions highlighting the glory of the pre-Islamic Iranian past. The 2500-year celebrations, as the pinnacle of those efforts, was held across 4 days at the ruins of Persepolis and included parades, feasts, a light show, exhibitions. According to documentation at the time, the Shah sought in those festivities, quote, to reawaken the people of Iran to their past and reawaken the world to Iran. Despite the suggestion of two key audiences, these lavish invitation-only events were closed to the Iranian general public, attended instead by some 600 foreign royals, celebrities, and dignitaries. At the opening event of the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the Shah famously tied the path of ease to the Persian Empire by placing himself as the descendant of a 2,500-year uninterrupted line of Iranian kings. On the final day of the celebrations, a ceremony opened the newly completed Shahya Tower, now the Azadi Tower, in the center of Tehran, where a new museum of Persian history featured a display of the Cyrus cylinder for the first time it would appear in Iran. Remember, it was found in Babylon. This was on temporary loan from the British Museum. And the cylinder was made the center of the official seal of the 2,500-year celebrations and commemorated on the official emblem of the event, as well as on stamps, medals, and coins minted for the occasion. And the focus on Cyrus continued when in 1976, the Shah went so far as to change the official Iranian calendar to begin with the accession of Cyrus the Great in 559 BCE rather than the Hijra of Muhammad, shifting the year from 1355 to 2535 overnight. The long-term impact and collective effect of this large field of cultural production on Iranian national identity has been significant. For as ever present as he seemingly has become in a current period of Cyromania, historians have shown that Cyrus the Great was not regarded by most Iranians as their ancestral national hero prior to these 20th century efforts. Cyrus is absent in key cultural sources like the Shahnameh and had been unremarked upon by revered Persian language poets and historians for centuries. The only texts that are likely to be known by educated Iranians relating to Cyrus's life and conquest prior to the discovery of the Cyrus cylinder in 1879 were ancient Greek sources like Xenophon's Cyropaedia or the Hebrew Bible, which may have been familiar among Jewish and Christian communities. So minimal was the role of Cyrus in these related sites and artifacts prior to the opening of the 1971 celebrations that the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae was described in official documents at the time as, quote, a lonely, plundered, almost forgotten place left to lizards, end quote. Scholars have suggested that the impetus for the modern project to fashion Cyrus the Great as a national hero was likely less to do with a desire to recuperate Iranian history, though undoubtedly it involved that, and more of one to create a politically useful heroic figure familiar and amenable to the modern and largely Western values and ideologies Pahlavi elites sought to promote. Specifically, this narrative asserted that Cyrus the Great had enacted the first Declaration of Human Rights and was the first leader to promote ideas such as religious tolerance, diversity, and individual freedoms. Buttressed by accounts from the ancient Greeks and by favorable translations of the Cyrus cylinder, in this interpretation, the cylinder confirmed the biblical accounts of Cyrus's freeing of the Jews in the book of Ezra, even if the cylinder never mentions the Jewish faith by people or name. By name, excuse me. The interpretations of key lines of text continue to be debated in the Cyrus cylinder, especially claims that Cyrus abolished slavery as a practice and that the cylinder should be read as the first charter or declaration of human rights. Citing scholarly accounts and histories from the 1920s, archaeologist John Curtis has shown that while the cylinder was understood upon its discovery in present-day Iraq to hold historical significance due to its description of Cyrus's taking of Babylon and its outlining of a genealogy, it was not recognized at the time for any connections to contemporary understandings of freedom, human rights, or democracy. That argument only emerged in the 1960s, when it was advocated by Iranian elites, publicists, state officials, and of course the Shah himself, for example, at the opening of the first United Nations Conference on Human Rights, which was held in Tehran in 1968. There, the Shah referred to the Cyrus cylinder as, quote, the precursor to the modern Universal Declaration of Human Rights, end quote. He made the same claim again in 1971 at the celebrations. And while these events were taking place in Iran and New York, the Shah's sister, Princess Ashraf, was presented an exact replica of the Cyrus cylinder to then Secretary General of the United Nations, providing a ready interpretation of its significance. Quote, the heritage of Cyrus was the heritage of human understanding, tolerance, courage, compassion, and above all, human liberty. The presence of this gift in a glass case on the second floor of the UN Secretariat continues to be referenced by Iranians in diaspora and by Western politicians to demonstrate Cyrus's founding role, and by extension, Iranians' role in the development of human rights as defined and enshrined by that same international institution. But experts like Curtis explicitly rejected these ideas, and academic skeptics decades earlier had also questioned the archaeological and historiographic evidence for those claims as they were being popularized. Meanwhile, vocal anti-Pahlavian activists in the 60s and 70s, including at the very same 1968 UN Conference on Human Rights in Tehran, pointed to the hypocrisy of promoting freedom, tolerance, and diversity as Iranian values at the same time that the Shah's secret police were actively suppressing ethnic minorities and imprisoning and torturing political opponents. Nevertheless, the marketing of Cyrus, his cylinder, and the Persian Empire to Iranians in the world through these kinds of public relations projects, scholarly books, academic journals, and conferences was to a large degree successful precisely because most Iranians did not know much about that historical period prior to the emergence of this field of cultural production. The pervasive repetition of those narratives and symbols through imperial nostalgia in the 21st century in the Iranian diaspora reveals how powerful those 20th century national symbolisms have been. But it also demonstrates how these significations have been mobilized in new contexts, where renewed meanings and new traditions around enduring symbols of ancient Iranian empire have proven useful. We see it quite clearly in the public displays of Cyromania that Iranian Americans have produced, whether in large 3D replicas of Cyrus's tomb in Southern California, or in reenactments of the Parade of Soldiers from the 25-year celebrations in the New York Persian Parade on Madison Avenue, or the use of Achaemenid architecture as features and backdrops for concerts, festivals, and wineries in California. Most recently, we've also seen it at political protests. So just last month, Cyrus emerged with his cylinder to lead a group of monarchist protesters at the Munich Security Conference. I don't know if you saw that. So, for many Iranian Americans, imperial nostalgia offers a form of relief against stigmatization, political stereotyping, and media portrayals that have created a troubling common sense about Iranians as Islamic fundamentalists or terrorists or enemy others of the United States. They recognize the symbolic power of the story of Cyrus, especially as a benevolent ruler of empire and the purported founder of human rights. That story has taken its perhaps most powerful form in the tale of Cyrus as the ideological father of American democracy. In this version of the story, Cyrus was an inspiration to Western philosophers and politicians, including especially Thomas Jefferson. This chain of claims that Cyrus the Great was a founder of human rights, that Thomas Jefferson was directly inspired by Cyrus the Great, and thus that Cyrus the Great was fundamental to the crafting of American democracy, is now consistently repeated in the United States. But it first began to emerge in Iranian American cultural production in the 2000s and gained mainstream attention during the 2013 US tour of the Cyrus Cylinder. On loan from the British Museum, it made 5 stops at elite museums like the New York Met, the Smithsonian in DC, and the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, in partnership with and co-sponsored by Iranian American organizations in each city. Titled The Cyrus Cylinder in Ancient Persia, A New Beginning, the exhibition featured the Cyrus Cylinder along ancient artifacts and, in the Smithsonian, Thomas Jefferson's annotated copy of Xenophon's Cyropedia. The book's presence in the libraries of U.S. founding fathers like Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin was used as supporting evidence for, quote, the importance of Cyrus to those who wrote the Constitution of the United States, end quote, and thus made the case for why Cyrus the Great should be regarded as important by elite American institutions and their hundreds and thousands of American visitors. The exhibition not only sought to demonstrate a global acceptance of the ancient Iranian roots of all the abstract notions attributed to the cylinder in the late 20th century, like human rights and tolerance, but also specifically American acceptance of the worthiness of Iranians in the present day, especially those who now live in the United States. Cyrus the Great was presented as the source of American values and liberal ideals, and thus a pre-modern contribution by contemporary Iranians as the heirs of Cyrus. The then executive director of the Farhang Foundation, the community co-sponsor for the Cylinder's LA stop, made this connection explicitly when she told the Los Angeles Times that the Cyrus Cylinder, quote, is important because of the ideals it represents that say who we really are. Non-Iranians can get to know the Iranian culture and its people in the correct light, rather than the portrayals in the media that we hear every day. Sounds familiar now, right? Through Cyrus the Great, Iranian Americans put forward an argument that they should no longer be rendered as enemies within, but as the original ideological donors to the very fabric of American identity. This representation of an ancient Persian artifact and its legacy in American history thus also suggested a new beginning for the representation of Iranians and Iranian Americans in the U.S., revising an American collective memory that marks the beginning of the U.S.-Iran relationship in 20th century political crises, whether the Iran hostage crisis, the 1979 revolution, or the 1953 overthrow of then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Here, a new beginning was located in the ancient reign of Cyrus the Great, allowing for a much earlier and friendlier relationship forged in a perceived ideological kinship. That perception relied as much on shared mythologies of benevolent empire as on the willingness to ignore the fundamental contradictions between liberal pronouncements of human rights and the illiberal actions of the leaders who pronounced them, whether the Shah, Jefferson, or otherwise. But there can be no doubt that this approach was successful in garnering attention. Over 400 news outlets reported on the exhibition, helping to draw in over 315,000 visitors in its 9-month tour. When it arrived at its final stop at the LA Getty Museum, Andalinos attended the cylinder exhibition in droves. It was reported at the time as the most well-attended exhibit in the museum's history. It's been surpassed now by another exhibition about ancient Persia. Dozens of school groups contributed to the high attendance figures, and Iranian American families especially turned out, some from across the country, lining up for hours with their non-Iranian colleagues and friends to bear witness. And once inside, Iranian Americans were moved to tears in front of the small cylinder in its glass case, feeling through it the pride and honor that had been denied them for decades in the United States. And they described this in media interviews, talking about how excited they were and how extremely emotional that they were. In one report to NPR, a woman was quoted, quote, "I burst into tears. I got so excited and something inside me just reacted. I don't know, maybe it's Iranian blood," unquote. So Iranian Americans with these deeply emotional responses found in the exhibition confirmation of their identifications with Cyrus, but also confirmation of the ideas ascribed to the cylinder during childhoods in Iran long before their migration. If Cyrus, as an icon representing the essence of Iranian identity, had influenced Jefferson, an icon representing the founders of American democracy, then in this exhibition, Iranian Americans, their American-born children, and their non-Iranian neighbors all were confronted with evidence not only of the importance of Cyrus, but of an ancestral Iranian goodness, one that had contributed to America before these immigrants had arrived at its shores. Just 3 years after the exhibition concluded in 2017, a large public sculpture directly invoking the Cyrus cylinder and its diasporic significance was unveiled in Los Angeles. Titled Freedom, a Shared Dream, or simply the Freedom Sculpture, the story of this monumental sculpture offers a clear demonstration of Cyromania as a strategy of inclusion and of all the hopes and future possibilities that many Iranian immigrants place in the American values articulated by a neoliberal form of multiculturalism. Both the sculpture and this professionally produced festival that inaugurated it were the projects of the Farhang Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in LA with a mission to celebrate, quote, "celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the community at large," end quote. Farhang, meaning culture in Persian, had also been the local co-sponsors of the LA stop of the 2013 tour of the cylinder. Its leaders described the importance of the freedom sculpture to the press in the days leading up to its big reveal, with reference to the same ideas put forward by that exhibition and about the influence of Cyrus and his cylinder. Quote, "The freedom sculpture is a precious gift from our community to the most diverse city in the US as a permanent reminder of these ideas of liberty, tolerance, and multiculturalism, which was espoused by Cyrus the Great over 2,500 years ago. The same ideas that were later adopted by the founding fathers of the United States and enshrined in our Constitution," end quote. Throughout the 4th of July event, these ideas were repeated on stage by politicians and organizers as fundamental to not just Americans, but also and originally to Iranians. A founding trustee of Farhang emphasized this to the Huffington Post, saying, quote, "These rights are not only part of our heritage, they came from us," end quote. Farhang's emphasis on Iranian American contributions as cultural gifts reflects an approach long deployed by other immigrant and minority groups seeking inclusion in U.S. national identity and its attendant racial hierarchy. For example, in the mid-20th century, Italian Americans had invoked their ancestor Christopher Columbus as among their many contributions to the United States, ultimately winning his commemoration in statues across the country and a federal holiday recognizing him, one that of course is now hotly contested. As historian Danielle Battisti has shown, Italian Americans effectively mobilized rhetorics of contributionism and immigrant gifts in their efforts to seek dignity and honor in the face of anti-Italian stereotypes and discrimination. They had done so by arguing that Italian immigrants, starting with Columbus, had helped transplant, quote, Western civilization to the Americas, end quote, especially the, quote, Republican traditions of ancient Rome, the roots of Christianity, and the cultural spirit of the Renaissance, all of which were fundamental to Americanism. Notably, Italian Americans did not resist this discrimination faced by all immigrants at the time, nor the racialized system that had excluded them as non-white. Battisti argued Italian Americans used pluralist tactics to write themselves into a narrative of white citizenship and laid claims to its benefits in the process, end quote. Contributionism as a minority discourse has always been informed and in many cases limited by racial and class politics. As a strategy for inclusion, contributionist claims have been successful for Ellis Island immigrants like Southern and Eastern Europeans, while failing to produce equivalent results for others like Chinese or Mexican Americans. Despite this, Iranian Americans continue to use contributionism in their responses to government securitization and negative media representations of Iranians. Like Italians before them, in order to demonstrate deservingness for belonging in the US, Iranian American leaders historically have appealed less to common cause with other immigrants, even fellow Middle Easterners, than or even to legal codes that should protect their rights. Instead, prevailing arguments have highlighted assertions of high socioeconomic class status, immigrant exceptionalism, and, like with the cylinder exhibition, shared ideals of tolerance and diversity, but with mixed results. To be sure, the diasporic uses of these symbols are also not separate from their uses in Iran, and for many in diaspora, reasserting these histories and symbols in the face of Islamic Republic erasure has served as an active resistance in the political battle over cultural history and collective identity. In this way, imperial nostalgia for a pre-Islamic Iranian past has simultaneously served as an explicit counter to the influence of Islam on Iranian culture, and also, in diaspora, as a counter to the racialization of Iranians by Americans as non-white and in many cases as Muslim. These are neither unrelated goals nor coincidental impulses. Expressions of Iranian identity as Aryan were central to 20th century Pahlavi nationalism and have emerged in 21st century America to not only put forward a proud national ancestry in the face of exclusion, but also to stake out a racial position seeking proximity to whiteness in the US racial hierarchy. This is accomplished in part by distancing Iranian Americans from the Islamic Republic and thus from Islam, and from the increasingly virulent post 9/11 discourses against Muslims. At best, this distancing is a covering strategy. At its worst, it's expressed explicitly by some Iranians in diaspora as anti-Muslim racism. Indeed, the prevailing arguments by Iranian Americans into the 2020s have continued to highlight shared liberal ideals of tolerance and diversity, assertions of high socioeconomic class status, and immigrant exceptionalism, while remaining relatively quiet on questions of racism or discrimination against other groups in the US, demonstrating instead a continued attachment to Aryan racial identities as whiteness. So what drives this continued confidence in the redeeming power of the rhetoric of immigrant contributions? The sculpture and the large festival marking its unveiling were expressions of all the hopes and future possibilities that many Iranian immigrants place in the American values articulated by neoliberal multiculturalism. Iranian communities in the greater Los Angeles area, considered by many to be the capital of the diaspora, provides an exemplary case of neoliberal subject formation. Without the symbolic or instrumental benefits of directed public support provided for immigrant communities in countries like Sweden or Canada, Iranian Angelenos have sought to develop belonging through promotions of imperial nostalgia, neoliberal interpretations of exceptional entrepreneurial and economic success, and celebrations of their immigrant gifts to the United States. The result is an Iranian American cocktail of nationalist interpretations of Iranian history and culture, with US assimilationist and neoliberal multiculturalist ideas about diversity, race, and class. It perhaps was telling that of all the possible quotes attributed to Cyrus the Great in the Cyropedia, the organizers of the Freedom Festival had highlighted the following on large LED screens, quote, "Freedom, dignity, wealth, these three together constitute the greatest happiness of humanity," end quote. The same quote would be used that year by then President Trump in his Nowruz message, where he told the Iranian people and all those around the world celebrating Nowruz, "On behalf of the American people, I wish you freedom, dignity, and wealth." These appeals, in form and function, are emblematic of American forms of multiculturalism where freedom and dignity are deeply intertwined with wealth, which then fosters certain kinds of claims over others. Neoliberal appeals to diversity and tolerance bring favor to those who have the resources to espouse it, but without requiring the policies to provide support for meaningful equity under the trappings of inclusion. These strategies reveal a belief among many Iranian Americans, sometimes articulated directly, that immigrants who have successfully attained equal status in American identity, including racial identity, have earned that inclusion. In this line of thinking, they have done so not by virtue of their legal rights as humans or as citizens even, but by contributing to American society, thereby earning equal rights and high status. In other words, they believe that the contributions of Iranians haven't been adequately recognized, or if they had, and if through their efforts they can make them so, then Iranian Americans would not continue to be stereotyped as terrorists or extremists, would not continue to be targeted by government agencies like Homeland Security, TSA, or CBP, and would not continue to face employment discrimination and having their bank accounts scrutinized and closed without warning. In short, they would be treated with dignity as equal U.S. citizens. This approach is reflective of at least two processes: a neoliberal construction of citizenship in the United States that has heightened immigrant contributionism as a strategy for inclusion as full members, and a related contest between and among diaspora leaders and culture producers over who owns culture, who controls representation, and ultimately who belongs and how. Neoliberal language of productivity, personal responsibility, self-regulation, and contribution permeate many immigrant understandings of U.S. citizenship and processes of U.S. subject formation. Consequently, when the nation of immigrants turns against certain citizens and certain immigrants, whether through discrimination, targeted surveillance, or outright bans, the common sense reaction by many Iranians has not been to see themselves as one among an array of racialized minorities in a common struggle for equal rights, but rather to respond through citations of exceptional academic achievement, economic success, and even ancient contributions to American values as markers of their deservingness. So to conclude, from the enormous 3D renderings of the Cyrus cylinder in parades and festivals in US cities to the innovative celebrations of Cyrus the Great Day on October 29th since about 2005, new meanings and traditions have emerged around nostalgia for enduring symbols of ancient Iranian empire in new geopolitical and cultural contexts. Rather than dismiss Cyromania and imperial nostalgia and diaspora as purely nostalgic or purely ideological, I consider Cyromania primarily as a strategy in competitions for inclusion. In these uses, imperial nostalgia clearly aligns a view of Iran's historical stature as a benevolent Persian empire with a similar view of the contemporary US and its empire. It's emerged and operates within neoliberal forms of power. Rather than making a case for inclusion as enactments of equality and basic human rights, the principles attributed in these narratives to Cyrus the Great, after all, these efforts instead traffic in the history of Cyrus to feed American assimilationist demands and to affirm the integrity of the American project, including who belongs as American and why. In other words, community members have bootstrapped their own inclusion by putting forward ancient Iranian history and culture as testimony to contemporary Iranian Americans' moral goodness through their contributions to American ideals, mythologies, and hegemonic structures, even if those structures had not effectively guaranteed Iranian American inclusion from the beginning. Thank you.
Oh, I gotta unmute myself. Oops, sorry. And exciting to see it as a book. As I told Amy before, I've seen iterations of her work, and it's wonderful to see it all come together in the pages of a book. And also love all your slides because they give so much visual texture to the topic that you're speaking about. I just have one question, and then I'm going to let others ask. I have a few questions, but the one that's on my mind is, given the question now of who's included, who's excluded, and the ambiguity of citizenship, do you see ways in which this earlier moment in Iranian American history will be useful or deployed again for inclusion? And that's sort of a speculative question, but it seems like Iranians will inevitably be dragged into this more directly, the certain conversation about who gets citizenship and who does not. And then as another thing that's connected to that, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on other strategies of inclusion that have happened on social media that are an extension of some of these earlier ritualistic mobilizations.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. One of the benefits of doing a project over a long period is that you can look back and see things that you couldn't see at the time, right? But also that things keep changing. So one of the downsides. So there's pros and cons there. I think with the benefit of hindsight, I was able to see something different than when I was doing my dissertation research, right? I was kind of not, I was too much in it to see the kind of structural connections. But now it really does feel like a historical project as a result, where I can now see the distinctions between the 2000s and the 2010s and today. And what we're experiencing right now in the United States is something that I sigh deeply about because I have very little words that I can use to adequately describe it. We don't know anymore where the firm ground is when it comes to rights and citizenship. It feels like those have been shaken intentionally, and where we once may have felt there was some safety in a legal document, whether that's a visa, whether that's a green card, whether that's a citizenship document, it no longer feels quite that way. So I don't know how to comment on that part at this particular moment that we're in. But I agree that it would not be surprising if Iranians get targeted again. Let's see how these negotiations go. It feels like we've been saying things like that since I was a child, that it's always like we're on the brink, and on the brink of either way. Yes, I'm with you on that. In terms of strategies of inclusion on social media, it's so funny you mentioned this. My next project is more about digital diasporic practice and has more to do with how we're using images, nostalgic images and nostalgic views of a pre-revolutionary period for various purposes online, often in ways that are unexpected to those who originally may have uploaded their family photos, for example, or videos. And so one of the things I've been kind of tracking also is this use of nostalgia for a different kind of political purpose than we may have seen 20 years ago. Um, I don't know if that's what you had in mind, Persis John, but for example, we saw the, you know, parade of Cyrus and also some Sasanian soldiers at the Munich conference a couple of weeks ago, right? So there's this kind of like imperial nostalgia being used, especially by monarchists, as a way to put forward, you know, Reza Pahlavi as a clear next leader, that kind of political project. But also the Trump administration had picked up on some of this imperial nostalgia, and it was on Twitter, you know, Mike Pompeo was wishing us all a happy Cyrus the Great Day, and we were all like, "What?" And you know, the State Department under Trump in the first Trump the first, I don't know how to describe it, this first administration, was also wishing us like, you know, happy Tirgan, happy Zoroastrian holidays that secular Iranians have not celebrated, right? But just kind of pulling on that same thread of ancient Persia as this ideal way of getting to an Iranian population who's fed up with the current regime. I imagine we will see a continuation of that if that becomes needed, right? It feels like a political tool that has been done before. So I don't know. Those are just my scattered thoughts at the moment. But did you have other like social media uses in mind?
Well, I was just thinking about some of an extension of some of what you're talking about when we see people posting their half scene, or when people
Yeah.
post about Yalda or Tadik, or, you know, Zeresh Polo or whatever. Like in some ways it feels like we've moved from the imperial nostalgia to like, look at how great we are. We have these great customs. You know, it's a more sharing and it's a softer kind of inclusion. It's not demanding like our greatness. It's, you know, so I just see it somewhat differently in that way. But
Mhm.
it's still a kind of begging for or asking for recognition in a way that I think is both positive and
Mhm.
also attempting to counter these, you know, constant negative headlines.
I don't see them as disconnected, actually. I don't think that's different. I think it's a continuation. And another version of this, I talk about the Daryush Winery in Napa, which is very much this blending of imperial nostalgia and food and wine, and that what we are best at is hospitality. Like culturally, what we do well is giving to others. And so therefore, you know, the fact that Persian food has been a kind of pathway into like mainstream acceptance by the New York Times or by, Sami Nosrat's book or whatever way we can. We get very excited when we see those things, right? Or some of us do anyway. And so there's I think it's kind of a continuation of a similar, trend. I mean, Mazda Brani can post that video and Iranians can post and say, yes, exactly, you're so right, because it's a shared kind of feeling of this, like, anything good, anything positive. And unfortunately, it also then bleeds into any kind of acceptance by mainstream, hegemonic kind of power, right? So any way that you see us as not bad, we are happy. And that's a sad kind of thing to recognize, that's almost like a desperation to be accepted, right? So I want to be really clear. I'm not in this project. I'm not trying to like judge people for their feelings about these things or how they use nostalgia or how they don't. Right. I think it's really interesting how much of an investment, an emotional investment, a financial investment, a time investment that people make, and that's what gets me curious. That like this needs to be taken seriously because it's not. We may personally, I don't really buy into the Cyrus the Great kind of narrative, but that doesn't matter. So many people do, and there's a reason that they do. There's a purchase to it that I think is really interesting and I want to learn more about. So that's the way I approached that question.
Thank you. Anybody else want to ask a question? If you could either raise your hand physically or do the little icon. Yeah, okay. Hi, Paniz.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you. Okay, I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate actually towards that perspective of Tahdig and Zirish Polo or whatever. I see the point you're making, right? I think there's that, but I think it's a lot more nuanced. I'm sitting an hour outside of Toronto right now. I grew up in Toronto, and I think the context really matters. Like in a place like Toronto, everybody eats everybody's food. So it's like not really like it's not me telling my friend, hey, like look at Tahdig and how cool it is. He already knew what Tahdig was because he'd eaten it like 50 times, So I think it's a little more nuanced than that. I think a lot of it has to do with just exposure, and now we have social media so people can see it a lot more. So there's that. But I do have questions actually. So I'm wondering if when you are talking about this kind of I guess difference between American perspectives around this like neoliberal way of belonging, I guess. How much of that is also affected by just general American exceptionalism, which I think from a Canadian perspective is something that Canadians always talk about. And also, I think I see a lot of it amongst my generation. So I'm the kind of generation that like I was born in Iran. I was there long enough to be a human and have memories and language and whatever. And then I moved to Canada as a teenager where I was young enough to then become Canadian, right? So there's a lot of people like there's a big enough crowd of people like me in places like Toronto that I think is unique, maybe perhaps when I like go to California or when I look at my family members in Europe. And I think this like constant influx from Iran to Canada has made it quite different in that there is this attitude of, oh, I don't actually care anymore. Like a lot of people like me, a lot of my friends, like we've given up on trying to like explain ourselves, like whatever, like do whatever you want to do, think whatever you want to think, like I'm out here doing my own thing, So yeah, so I'm just like I just spewed a bunch of information, but I'm just wondering how you think these things relate and how they interact and play.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. I completely agree with you. So one of the reasons I wanted to do a comparative study is because honestly, I had a professor say to me at some point, well, it's just Iranian culture isn't the same everywhere. Like everyone's singing the same Andy song and everyone's doing the same thing. And I was just like, no, I don't think it's the same everywhere. Like there are certain cultural elements that maybe are popular across the diaspora, but that doesn't mean they're all doing the same thing or that people think the same thing about them and that it's all just like, so who cares? So no, absolutely. And choosing my field sites, one of the things that was really important to me was that I compare Iranian communities who don't share the same migration trajectories and don't share the same like host society political structures, but that have enough similarity to make them comparable. I mean, I got to tell you, like, maybe never again will I try to compare three field sites. I think it's like such a challenge, and it was, it's taken me this long to do for a reason. But one of the important distinctions is absolutely this distinction between the United States, where you get this huge population, so you can't really ignore it, but they are not very representative of the rest of the diaspora, despite how much of an oversized kind of view we have of it in the literature. And so my dissertation didn't include America, didn't include the United States, but it was kind of like the like elephant in the room when it comes to these kinds of issues. So I had to kind of do extra field work to deal with the LA side, but agree completely that the Toronto landscape is really, really different from the Los Angeles one. It also includes people who were in Canada in the 70s, but a very small number, right? And so you have much more migration from the 90s onward, especially in the 2000s and continuing, right? Whereas in the United States, for various structural reasons, we do see a kind of slowdown after the mid 80s and again in the 2010s. So I do think that those things are really important. My whole first chapter really is tracking those migration trends and distinctions and comparing them to the ways of, like, where did they arrive to, right? So Iranians are leaving, where are they going, and how are they being treated once they arrive, and what can they make of it and not? And so a lot of the things that I think Paris and I were talking about with food, yeah, in Toronto doesn't make sense because, yeah, you have, first of all, as someone who was doing their like dissertation in LA, all the restaurants in LA felt very traditional, like you were not going to get anything innovative. And then I get to Toronto and I've got Fest and June pizza, and I've got like places that only serve breakfast and brunch, and you're like, how, and why not in LA where you have so many people and such a big population, that why is this not happening there? So very different culturally, very different in terms of population. And I would say in Europe as well, different in another way, right? And so the Swedish context is also really important, I think, in this kind of triangular comparison I'm trying to do, because again, we've got ongoing migration, and you've got immigrant replenishment is the kind of sociological term for that. But you also have a very different initial migratory pattern that was mostly refugees, right? They weren't coming with resources, and oftentimes they were, activists. They were politically active and political refugees, not religious refugees like in LA. So you had a very different kind of initial community that was arriving right when Sweden starts experimenting with multiculturalism and how to kind of do multiculturalism. And so I thought that was a very interesting distinction from the other two cases. But yet the problem with these talks is that you can't really say a lot about one without missing out on the others. So you didn't hear as much about the other two. But hopefully in future talks, I'll kind of switch the case that I focus on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Misha.
So this is kind of a strange question just because so when I saw the title of the event, this is not what I expected it to be about. So I want to talk about the word inclusion because I read it as like, I myself, and I think a lot of Iranians I know in diaspora have often felt excluded from the Iranian diaspora community. So I read it as like, well, I'm thinking about like what you're talking about, Siromania. Like there are Iranians like us who like don't relate to that. We don't.
Yes.
And so like where do we find our strategies of inclusion in both the Iranian diaspora community and also like showing that like not all Iranians are like that,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. It makes me think about my title now, like, But I take your point. One of the things when I first moved to LA that I realized was that, yeah, I did not really fit into a lot of those circles, and that I started finding my people as those who also didn't feel like they were, that they were the black sheep in there, And whenever we talk about inclusion, the question is always inclusion into what, right? So in this book, it's a couple different things. It's inclusion into a mainstream for some people. It's inclusion as full citizens with belonging. It's lots of different things you can argue. Is it a society level? Is it a community level? But I didn't really get into that question of how those who feel excluded from the Iranian diaspora are navigating that position. But that would be a great study if you're interested in doing one. I think it would be really interesting. And there's plenty of people who could speak to that experience, I think, in many different parts of the diaspora. It's not just a US thing or a LA thing or something like that. The other thing I might, well, I'll see if other people have questions. If not, I'll come back to you with another idea. Thank you so much for that point.
Just want to add something to Misha's comment. I think it's also as Iranians have become more intermarried with other communities, that question of inclusion has a different tenor, right? So if you're half Iranian, you might not, yeah, ditto, and Amy too. You might not feel included in either the Iranian context or in the American context. And I think Iranians have those experiences too, like when they go back to Iran. So I think it would be interesting to do a sort of multi-generation and, mixed Iranian. Amy and I are waiting for the next generation to like do that study.
You can interview us. We'll tell you what it was like in the 80s and the 90s. I think that's part of it though, Persis. When I think about that half kind of idea or this like dorage word, which I really dislike very much, that's something that I think part of it is that because you were definitely, and I think even I still were kind of early in the like birth flow of halfies, if I will, that we had to navigate a lot of the really uncomfortable rooms as a result, where Iranians kind of looked at us as like either just clearly not enough or as cute, right? Your Persian is so sweet, and you're doing your best, but there's still going to be some comment, right? And on the other side, like people still see you as kind of from somewhere else, but in this weird ambiguous way that they don't really, they have to ask about. It becomes a question. Anyway, a different study for another for another time. But I do encourage someone to take up that project. That would be very interesting to hear about.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll ask a question that sort of looks at the historical trajectory of your work. I wonder if you saw, like, in moments where people are mobilized to see positive things happening in Iran, such as the Green Revolution or woman life freedom, if those two become moments of, uttering some notion of inclusion, like, hey, look at us, we're like standing up for freedom, or hey, we have all these brave women. Is that something that you're tracking? And how do those events in Iran in some ways influence the same kind of conversation that we're having now about things like the Persian Day Parade and the Cyrus Cylinder?
Yeah. No, very good question. So I think a lot of the tendencies of, let me step back. There is an assumption that a lot of these ideas about Cyromania are only carried by diaspora, or only things that people who are monarchists care about, which is just not the case. I mean, a lot of the things that are it used to be before, direct to consumer marketing and production, that the best jewelry, the nationalist jewelry you could get was from Iran, right? It wasn't made in diaspora, it was made in Iran, these beautiful necklaces, the farahars and things like that. So it's like clearly happening in Iran and being transmitted around the diaspora as well. So I don't want to make any kind of assertion that it's only a diasporic phenomenon at all. And I also see how social media has only made that more complex, right? The kinds of sharing that goes on and the influencing in both directions, many directions. In terms of political movements, I think with the Green movement, we're still in the early periods of this, right? So a lot of the things that I was describing happened in the late 2000s, around 2009, 2010. And so I think a lot of the organizing that ended up happening started because people met each other on the street, protesting during the Green Movement in LA and in Toronto and in Stockholm and other places. Like those were ways that young people were finding their people. To your point, Misha, that there were people who were feeling isolated and like they didn't really, get along with other Iranians. And then the Green Movement happened and they, rushed to kind of support their brethren, and then they found some of their people. So in Stockholm, the way this thing started was very much a group of young people trying to support Iranian freedom movements in Iran, in Stockholm. And one of the things they wanted to do was to show support for Iranians who were in the streets in 2010 for Charsham Mystery. Like, if I don't know if you remember that 2010, like right after the Green Movement thing, that Charsham Mystery was seen as this moment where they're going to take to the streets again. Like, this is a time that we need to show solidarity. And so part of the one of the quotes that I have from one of the founders was like, we are celebrating here in Stockholm tonight because we want to show solidarity with Iranians in Iran tonight. This is Charsham Mystery, right? So there's always been this connection. And for all of these organizers, they're very much attuned to what's going on in Iran and are very much concerned with what goes on in Iran. Which is why with the Canada chapter, this like kind of non-political or apolitical kind of imperative has become a real problem and a challenge. And it's a problem for a lot of organizations. I don't want to make it sound like in the US people aren't dealing with this either. We've got so much fragmentation in our diaspora that has to do with political stuff that, the reaction has been, well, let's make it a non-political organization. We'll just have a cultural organization, and then it'll be more unifying. We'll kind of heal some of that fragmentation through culture. And this is something some of the Teargown founders had talked to me about in the early days of their organization, that this is something they wanted to do, was to kind of, we focus on culture and not politics because it's something everyone can agree on. No one's going to argue about culture. Of course, they do argue about culture. But the first with the Me Too kind of challenge to Tirgan, that was kind of what I kind of trace a couple of stress tests this organization has faced. They've always had people who have, made complaints about them. Just like every organization, someone's going to complain. But the kind of stress tests of Me Too was where we started to see some cracks. And their reaction was to do as Canadian multiculturalism would ask them to do, which was kind of craft the DEI statement, hire a consultant, create a method for reporting sexual harassment, that kind of, procedural steps as a method of kind of band-aiding the issue, and not actually making a strong statement against gender-based violence or other kinds of sexual harassment. And that worked in the Iranian community of Toronto for a lot of people, and not for some other people, right? So that's when you see some cracks there. And then COVID comes, that's a big challenge. They managed that pretty successfully, in the sense that they were able to pivot to digital kind of programming thanks to Canadian state funding. They kind of got a big grant in order to keep going, that in the US they definitely wouldn't have had, right? And then finally, Women Life Freedom really challenged what to do. And for a non-political organization, they went all in after at first not going all in and hearing from the community pretty harshly. Where are you? You are our organization. You are our voice. Why are you being so silent about this? And this is not okay. And so then they put all their chips in, and they had this big, event, Free Iran event. Yes, Pawnees, the beginning of the chapter is the Canada Mourns event that Tirgan did with about the Ukrainian flight. Absolutely. In that one, they kind of rose to the challenge, though, right? That stress test they did, they managed to be the conduit to federal government and other political outlets in a non-political way, right? That they're still doing this kind of balancing act between being political and being cultural. Well, that's my take on it. I'm curious to hear what you think. But the Women Life Freedom one is when they really kind of went all in and ended up basically having a political rally in the guise of a concert, and that really changed it. Yeah.
Are they still active?
Tirgan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause I heard having some financial difficulties.
Yeah, it's from that event.
Okay.
They rented out this huge, basically where the Toronto NBA team plays, like big arena. And anyway, they got into some financial difficulty because of that move.
I see.
Yeah. Pawnees, what's your read? I'm curious as a Torontonian.
I think that I'm not the only Canadian on the call, so if someone else wants to chime in, but
Sure.
I think part of it was also just a general fracture within Canadian society towards the Liberal government during COVID and afterwards. So the fact that some funding was coming from the government and people were starting to become more and more antagonistic towards the Trudeau administration, I think that was also part of it. But that's my read on it. I don't know, but I think it all kind of went together. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the other thing I would say is that just like as a byproduct of the community here being really diverse and kind of having been sustained through waves of immigration, then you end up with a very, very complicated relationship inside the community.
Yes.
Whereas I will never forget people having a fist fight the night of the vigil when we were there for the Ukrainian flight. Like it was the day when they announced that it had been a missile that had hit the plane. And at night there was supposed to be a vigil. You show up and there's three distinct groups with different political ideologies. And then it broke into a fist fight. The police had to be called. Like that is the kind of tension that also exists side by side.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, LA, we have a similar problem where it's, there's a place you're supposed to protest at, it's the federal building, and there's always going to be one group on one side of the street and one group on the other side of the street, and the cops are there not to protect them from driving cars, but to protect them from each other. Unfortunately, unfortunately we see that in a lot of places. In Toronto, I agree with you, is perhaps particularly what's the word I want to use? Not fragmented, because it's fragmented in a lot of places, but in many different ways. I guess it's that diversity that you're pointing to. It's a very interesting community for so many reasons. I hope there's more work being done on it. I know there's a lot of work to be done on the Iranian community in Toronto. I'm looking at you. I'm looking at Shiva. I'm looking at all of y'all.
Yeah, and that poster I put in there was an invitation.
Oh, yes, good. Yes, please submit your proposals for that conference. I see a question, when does the book come out? It should come out in October. It's not a website yet. Persis June was very kind enough to ask me to talk about it as a preview. So just a preview. We don't have a link or anything just yet.
Amy might be updating her website though, so you could follow her on social media and her website.
Definitely.
Any other questions? Okay. I think we should let Amy go because she's on East Coast time, but I want to thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I know many of us will look forward to holding that book in our hands, your baby. And I also want to say that Amy's work at Oklahoma State is important because she's both straddling the diaspora and straddling the larger global context of in which Iran circulates. So please follow her work at Oklahoma State, especially as I'm winding down the center at the end of June. I think most people know the center will not be funded after June 30th in lieu of scholarships, which is a very sad thing. It's kind of reflective of the moment that we're in. But as Amy pointed out, there are many wonderful scholars working in this field, and we're going to try and keep collaborating and putting these ideas out there. And we do welcome younger scholars. So please know that even if we don't have a physical home, there are many people who want to welcome you into this field. So, oh, Yashar, you have a question?
Yeah, just curious regarding what you said about the center shutting down. Are you going to continue your social media presence, Persis, or are you going to discontinue that?
Well, I'm gonna let it be there. I don't know how much energy I'm retiring also. I just feel like this is kind of a moment for me to sort of recognize what's happening in higher education. But I think definitely gonna keep the Instagram going, and my friend Hasti, who's helping today with the technology for this, so that they would continue to help me too. And I think it's I think it's an opportunity not to lose the kind of communities that are sometimes built around social media. I mean, we have 10,000 followers. So I welcome any suggestions about how to use that space and keep it meaningful for people.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. And thank you to Amy, and have a good evening. Amy, stay on for a second because I want to take a
Okay.
picture.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks for all of your questions and comments. I would love to hear anything else. So if you are want to start a dialogue, please email me, amy.malek@okstate.edu. I'd be very happy to engage with you.